You can definitely tell that this episode of Gridman was done by Studio Trigger because it features the three things that make them amazing: giant monsters, superheroes, and lots of fan service. This episode of SSSS.GRIDMAN did not try to hide the sexy. It opened up with a lot of fan service of Akane in a swimsuit. So if that's something that you were looking forward to, congratulations. You're probably going to love this episode right here. Is that a rocket in your pocket? Before we go any further, let me just go ahead and say this is going to be a quick fire review because I am busy as a motherfucker with everything going on in my adult life. So I'm just going to give my quick thoughts about this episode of Gridman, which was a glorified beach episode. Yeah, except that it actually didn't take place at the beach. It was actually all about Yuta and his classmates going on a rafting trip. And of course, they go out into the middle of nowhere where a giant monster decides to attack everyone and Gridman has to save the day. What's really interesting about this episode is that, like I said, it's kind of like a beach episode, which means you're going to get a lot of fan service. And yes, trust me, you will. There is a lot of Akane TNA in this episode and even something there for the Rika fans. But most of this episode is actually dedicated to Akane, which I do find kind of interesting considering that she's the main villain of the series, and still her motivations are completely unknown. All I know is if anybody pisses her off, she decides to summon a giant monster of doom. And what I really love about the monster in this episode is that it is like literally the biggest monster that we've ever seen thus far. It is just the size of a freaking city. And I absolutely love the parallel of this little conversation that Yuta and Utsumi have at the very beginning of the episode. When they're actually heading out to the country to go on this rafting trip, they comment about the fact that all of these giant kaiju, which are still sort of in the background of all of these cities, have just become just the natural elements of their world. Something that they don't even think about anymore. They're just sort of there in the background. And then finally, when they go to nature, what happens? They quite literally end up fighting a monster which is the background itself. I thought that was very clever. What I really loved about this episode, though, it was, again, a showcase for another one of the members of the Neon Genesis Junior High. And this time, it's going to be Boar, the feisty little girl, and her power allows Gridman to transform into a giant drill-infused version of itself. Gurren Lagann fans, I'm sure you're going to appreciate that, and despite the fact that it is covered with a bunch of sharp drills, there is no drilling to be had, which you thought would actually be exactly what they would use against this giant monster, which is made out of a massive chunk of the earth. No, basically it just amounts to firing more beams. The good thing is it looks really freaking awesome. I cannot understate how good the action scenes in this series looks, and how in every episode they manage to do something kind of cool and unique, and a nice spin on a classic. In fact, I think some of my favorite action scenes from this episode was just watching both Anti and Gridman just fire missiles all over the place, and an absolute barrage of pure awesomeness. It's the type of thing that Studio Trigger's always been good at, but again, I have to say, like I said, I'm slightly disappointed that this battle mostly amounted to just, again, firing a lot of weaponry at this thing. I thought with drills, they were going to end up, like, drilling through this thing's freaking body, kind of like Mario in Super Mario Galaxy 2. It never really ended up happening. But the most clever thing about this episode, in my opinion, was the fact that they actually didn't have access to Junk the computer, and it was up to the Neon Genesis Junior High to actually get this to them in the country, to the point where they have to buy it, put it on a train, put it on a dolly, bring it all out into the middle of nowhere, hooking it up with an untold amount of extension cords and stingers. It's just hilarious actually watching it happen. They're going to have to come up with some sort of more portable solution in order to make this whole Gridman thing actually happen. It's even funny too when they hook it up for the first time. Gridman's like, where the hell are we? Where are we right now? The series actually does a really great job of having a great sense of humor about just about every single thing that it is doing. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and I think that's been one of my favorite things about Gridman thus far. It doesn't get way too up its own ass. I'm talking about you, darling in the Franks. But again, like I said, let's break this down. Yuta and his friends go to the country, a giant monster pops up, they transform into Gridman when Neon Genesis shows up, they go into the big drill form, they fight it, and that's the end of the episode. There's a mysterious explosion at the end, which means God knows what, and that's the end of the episode. I wish I had more time to actually give my thoughts about this episode. What I will say is, and I'll boil it down to this in the rundown, this was a fan-servicey, action-packed, and very visually stunning looking episode. Basically, exactly what you were seeing from the first couple episodes of Gridman. What I will say is the episode managed to be refreshing because we finally leave the city and we're in the forest. That alone is really kind of what makes this episode. And I would still like some of these action scenes to go on maybe just a little bit longer. I know that's, just maybe wanting a little too much icing on my cake, but still, I just really want to see a much more lengthier and crazier action scene for the series. That being said, if you wanted more Gridman, more awesomeness, more fan service, more crazy transformations and monster battles, you're gonna get it in this episode, which is why I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Thank you all for watching this review. I'll see you all next time, and as always, stay down now, baby.